Well, hello. Welcome back. And today we are going to be talking about musical counting. And a one, and a two, and a three, and a four, and a. Wow. A lesson in counting. Counting is pretty simple. 1, 2, 3, 4. Piece of cake, right? Well, you see, the problem is musical counting is not always straightforward. In music, you count beats or pulses, basically fragments of time. And these beats, they're not the same thing as notes. Well, I guess sometimes they are, but sometimes they aren't. And it almost always changes within one piece of music, and sometimes even within the measure. A lot of times you'll hear people say, "Oh, I just feel it. I feel the rhythm." No. No, it's much more complicated than that. So, what can we do to make counting easy? We have to dissect it, figure out what to do, and figure out why we are doing it. And then we understand it. And then we practice it. And then it becomes so fundamental to our musical being that, okay, well, then you can feel it. But all of that other stuff has to happen first. You have to understand what you're doing, you have to practice doing it, and it has to become so second nature that it's like walking or talking. It's just something you always can do. The first step on this adventure is figuring out your time signature. For sake of keeping this explanation easy, we're going to talk about the most common time, called common time. You'll see a C at the beginning of your music. Sometimes it's not there. Sometimes you'll see the actual numbers written out. That would be 4/4. And like all time signatures, that top number is going to tell you the number of beats per measure, in this case, 4. And the bottom number is going to show you what type of note gets one beat, in this case, the quarter note. And this is a good rule of thumb to have, knowing what you're counting. That way you know what is 1. So for our measures, we're using these 4 beats or 4 pulses for every measure. And to visualize this, we're going to call each beat one of these blank spaces. So we clearly see 4 beats in this measure. And we know quarter note gets the beat. So logically, we can put 4 quarter notes in this measure, 1 in each beat. What else can go in the measure? Well, so far it's pretty simple, right? We did quarter notes, but we know there are other types of notes and rests other than just quarter notes and quarter rests. And of course, we can put these other notes in the measure. Now, you can do dotted notes, dotted rests. We're not going to talk about them. We're just going to talk about basic counting. So we'll start with easy things. Notes longer or larger than 1 beat. The first one we'll talk about is the half note. A half note is worth 2 beats. In other words, 2 quarter notes tied into a single note. And of course, we call this long because it is longer than a single beat. And it works out pretty nicely because if you think about it, if there are 4 beats in the measure, and the half note is worth 2 of them, that is worth half of the measure. So half note. There's another type of long note called a whole note, and as the name suggests, it takes up the whole measure. So in other words, 4 beats, like combining all 4 quarter notes into one big note. It would look like this in the measure if we had 2 half notes. You see each note takes up 2 beats, and the whole note takes up all 4. And you'll notice that the whole note is not placed on beat 2 or beat 3, because if that were the case, it would only take up the remaining beats in that measure, which is less than 4. And we know the whole note takes up 4, so it has to be there. The same goes with the half notes above it. We can't put a half note on beat 2 and a half note on beat 3 because each one separately takes up 2 full beats. But it's the shorter notes that get a little bit more confusing because the notes are shorter than a full beat. This is where people start to just feel their way through it. And we need to be a little bit more specific. Imagine you wanted to buy a candy bar and borrow money from your friend, and you ask your friend, "How much money do you have in your pocket?" You need to know for sure exactly how much so you can buy this candy bar. And they might say, well, $4 and some change. Well, that could be $4.09. It could be $4.99. Or it could be $6.55. They could have a fistful of coins. Who knows? And music is just like this. If we don't count in music, we could be sloppy or inaccurate with our rhythms, and that's not good if we are trying to play in time with other people. So in order to be specific, we have to start thinking of parts of the beat that are smaller than the full beat. So the first type of note that's smaller than a full beat is smaller than a quarter note, and that's called the eighth note. And we know that there are 2 eighth notes in each quarter note, and it works out well because each eighth note is of equal size. So 2 eighth notes fit equally into the same space as a quarter. So essentially what we're going to do is we're going to take each beat and divide it into 2 parts. What used to look like this for our measure now becomes this. And you see that each beat is being divided into 2 equal smaller units. But in looking at that, you see now there are 8 blanks, but you see they're grouped together. How do we count it? It sort of gets confusing. Now that we've divided that big beat into 2 smaller parts, how do we count them? Is it still 4 beats in the measure, or is it 8? Well, the way to start thinking about it is to go back to the time signature. The time signature told us 4 beats in a measure, so it is still 4 beats. So then what do we do about the other blank spaces, the other parts of the beat? How do we count it? Well, we start just like reading a book. We go from left to right. And the counting will start at the front part of the beat. The first thing that happens in each beat is the count of the beat. So we have 4 beats in the measure. We have 1, 2, 3, 4. But you see there's still the other half of the beat. What about the rest? We have to call the other part of that beat something else. Because we're vocalizing this, we have to account for each part of the beat. So the way we do that with eighth notes is we add and, or if we are writing it out, probably just a plus sign. So we have our big beats, the front part of the beat, as it were, and we're going to add and to the second half of each beat. So we get 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and. So instead of playing these eighth notes, we're counting them. And instead of giving them note names, because it could be anything, it could be different notes in different parts, we'll just label the parts of the beat 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and. If we had eighth notes in a measure, it would look like this. But wait, there's one more thing. The last type of note that's commonplace in music, of course there's a lot more, but the one you see most often is a little bit faster, a little bit shorter than the eighth note. It is the 16th note. And just like we had a relationship between eighth notes and quarter notes, we have the same relationship between 16th notes and eighths, where there are 2 16ths in 1 eighth. So now what does this look like? Well, we've done this before. We've taken the quarter notes and divided them into eighth notes. But now we're taking those eighth notes and dividing them into 16th notes. And you can see the process. We took that first beat and divided it equally into 2 smaller parts. And then we're taking those smaller parts and dividing it equally into 2 smaller parts still. Just like we have with eighth notes, we're going to keep on counting, and we're going to keep the first thing of the beat, the number, the count. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4. So we still see our beats. We still have ands, just like we did with the eighth notes. And we're going to start where the and was in the eighth note. So the and of the eighth note was on the second half of the beat. We're just going to take that straight down into the 16th notes. When we add our numbers, we'll get counting that looks like this. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and. And that should look and sound familiar. It should look and sound like eighth notes, because it is. But the tricky part is that we took those eighth notes and divided them one further. And that's those little spaces that you see that are left, that are unnamed. So the way we vocalize this is we take that first space and we add an E to it. So we have 1E, 2E, 3E, 4E. And the last space gets, well, it says A, but we say so it's So 1E and a, 2E and a, 3E and a, 4E and a. So there's our counting. Each note is going to be on a 1, an E, an and, or an a. But, oh no, rests. Did we forget about them? Don't worry. The rests work exactly like notes. As we know, the rests and notes are basically the same thing. They take up the same amount of time. They take up the same amount of space. A whole note and a whole rest are both 4 beats. A half note and a half rest are both 2 beats. The only difference is that rest is silence. It's sort of misnamed. You're not actually resting, you're just not making sound. So, what did we do? First, we divided the measure into 4 beats because that's what our time signature said to do. Next, we took those beats and we divided them into 2 smaller units of time. They are the eighth notes. And then we took the eighth notes and we divided them into 2 smaller units of time, and they are the 16th notes. Then we had to define the counting. How does the counting work? First, we put in the beats, 1, 2, 3, 4. We added the midway point between the beats. That would be the eighth notes. That's the ands. And then we did the subdivisions of those eighth notes for the e's and the uhs. So looking there, there's a lot going on. You have numbers, you have shapes, you have letters. With all these things, what do you count? And it's a good question because you might be counting something different than your stand partner. And both of you might be thinking of something different than what your conductor is showing you. That's okay. The first rule of thumb is to start with your time signature. Start with that top number. In this case, we've been working with 4, 4, so I would count in 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. But you might want to look ahead. Maybe you have measures with eighth notes in them or measures with 16th notes. And if that's the case, you might want to think of those faster notes rather than the longer notes. So let's say you have a measure of eighth notes. You might be thinking 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and, rather than just the big beats. Because even if you have the quarter notes and you're thinking 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and, first of all, it makes your quarter notes more precise. And secondly, it makes you ready for those measures where you do have the eighth notes. It's like you'll be playing along with what you're already thinking in your head. And if you're doing that, if you are counting those shorter notes while you're playing the bigger notes, that is called subdividing. And this is one of your director's favorite words. I'm absolutely positive. This is a good thing to do. Always do it. So now you're going to be on your own. All you have to do is keep on counting, and you can count on the fact that your director wants you to do this. Happy counting!